going to talk about mostly two things. In the 19th century, we haven't really talked about the rise of nationalism. Nationalism is really one of the most famous events that really happened in the 1800s, especially with Europe overall. Then I will get into and talk about imperialism, which I think is often called new imperialism, which both those are major causes of World War I later in the early part of the 20th century. So I'll get to those today. Probably spend more time on really nationalism more than anything. Anyway, I'm going to first go ahead and I'm going to talk about the rise of nationalism, which nationalism was a major event that really, like I said, changed Europe a lot, like drastically. The map of Europe was pretty much changed later. A lot of this came in the aftermath of the revolutions of 1848, which I've kind of touched a little basis on a little bit prior, I think, in these lecture series on the 19th century. But a lot of it, you had the age of Metternich, where Clemens von Metternich with the Congress of Vienna tried to keep conservatism pretty much stable in Europe. But that gets eroded by the rise of nationalism, which really takes off. And nationalism is really one of those major events that really changed the course, really, of Europe. And they think it was a major cause of why World War I, later World War II, happened as well. So both those are definitely caused by it, for sure. Kind of a scary word today. I guess nationalism is now being replaced by globalism or something like that. And people prefer that over nationalism. But nationalism back then was a major thing. Here's kind of expand this slide right here, but you can see that the concept of it was the idea of creating a modern state in Europe. Most nation states refer to a country that represents a group of people living in a similar geographic region, like an area of Europe or wherever it is throughout the world. They might have a common language, common history, culture, traditions. It could be also similar ethnicity as well, or even religion. You could say things like that also as well. And you can see that, if you think about this, they think that modern nationalism, like the origins of it anyway, they think were heavily influenced by several things. The French Revolution definitely, influenced it. Also, the rise of Napoleon. Napoleon's, conquests of Europe spread the ideas of nationalism or nation-state ideas. Places like Germany, Italy, etc., even in Latin America, ideas of liberalism, radicalism, those kind of things also were part of it. And then don't forget people having just national pride about being a certain ethnicity or nationality, etc., were definitely other causes of it also as well. Now, Europe itself, at that time was, you think about Europe, like if you go back to like the early 19th century in general, there's basically, they're like these countries here, Italy, Germany, Greece, Hungary, Poland, they didn't exist. So none of those countries really existed at that time. Most of the major European nations were like Britain, France, Austria, Russia, Spain, Portugal. Those are your major countries throughout Europe at the time. And so these countries will come later, like between the 19th and 20th centuries, especially the first two on that list. And we'll talk mostly about them overall today. Let me go ahead and first talk about something that was kind of real popular, though, in the early 19th century, and that was Greek independence. I don't know if you know much about that, but it's around 1830s, 32, I think, to be exact. You have, of course, the Greek independence movement that took off, and they had a conflict that was called different names, the Greek War for Independence. I think the Greeks call it also the Greek Revolution, sometimes Revolution of 1821. And prior to that, most of that region of Europe, like in the southeastern part of Europe, was controlled by the Ottoman Empire, which you can see Greece on the bottom there, where the Ottoman Empire is in that map. So that was an area that they wanted to be independent. partially because the Greeks were Christian, like Orthodox Christian primarily. Of course, the Turks were Muslim, and so they wanted to break away and become more independent. And so Greek independence was heavily backed by countries like France, Britain, Russia, because all those three countries were Christian. They also saw the Greeks as being like the birthplace of Western civilization, and so a lot of volunteers went there to fight. I think there's a story about I think this man named Lord Byron. May have heard of him. You see in that picture on the right was a famous Romantic poet. He actually went over there, fought in the Greek War for Independence, and actually died during the war, I think in 1824. And so this was a very popular movement. And Greece got their independence mostly because of the fact that the other powers sent armies and naval forces to fight against the Turkish Empire. And the peak battle was the Battle of Navarino, which happened in October of 1827. And the Turks their naval force was just destroyed in that battle in October. And so after that, the Greeks were able to get their independence afterwards. I think this week, I think it's I want to say March 25th is the date. That's the day that the Greeks celebrate Greek Independence Day. So yeah, the Greeks was definitely one of those first states to really get their independence. At that point in Europe and become like a separate nation state. There are other countries that break away too. Most of them are under the Ottoman Empire, like Belgium. Of course, that's separate. They kind of formed their own nation state in 1830. But Romania, Bulgaria, Kingdom of Serbia, countries like that, they kind of break away from the Ottoman Empire in that part of Europe, kind of west of the Black Sea, and they become independent states also as well. That Kingdom of Serbia is an interesting one too. Serbia, is one of those states that helps to start World War I, 1914, which I'll, of course, get to later. Now, one of the things I want to talk about next, which is real big, of course, that happens in Europe in the 19th century, of course, is Italian nationalism really takes off in the 1800s. And they think that Italian nationalism was something that was started by this man named Giuseppe Mazzini. You see there in that image. He's one of several major leaders of the Italians that were kind of involved in creating Italian nationalism and then eventually the unification of Italy later. It was often called the nickname they dub it is usually the Risorgimento, is what the Italians called it, which I think Risorgimento in Italian means resurgence. It was a resurgence in Italian pride and having a unified Italian state. And Mazzini was one of the figures that really was involved in trying to, nationalize all of Italy into one unified state. And he's one of several leaders. If you kind of go back to that picture I just showed you a second ago, but they're often called the fathers of the fatherland. That's the nickname they often call a lot of the men in Italy that helped to unify it into one Italian state. Mazzini, Victor Emmanuel II, who was a king, Count Cavour, of course, Garibaldi, who's very famous, and there's their images right there, Mazzini, Cavour, and Garibaldi, who was a very famous Italian general in the 19th century. And so all those men really helped to unify Italy long term. Mazzini formed this secret society in Europe that was called Young Italy. It was founded around 1831. It was mostly comprised of men that were around 40 and younger. And they favored unifying Italy, but as a democratic republic. That was one of the things that they favored. And Mazzini was considered radical for his time. And because of his radical nature and all that, his movement, he was later exiled That's one thing about it, because of age of Metternich, and uh, I guess he was forced to flee Italy to other states, and he wouldn't really come back to Italy until after Italy actually unified, which is later. Now, kind of explain like why is it that Italy had such a tough time. I'll get to Cavour in a second. He's kind of very instrumental. He was kind of the brains behind the whole Italian unification movement. At the time, most of Italy was heavily controlled by two powers primarily. Most of it was controlled by Austria, especially in the northern territories. And the southern part was kind of controlled by the Spanish indirectly through a kingdom and dynasty that was called the Kingdom of the Two Sicilies. And so all this control was basically, in foreign hands. And there was very few states that actually were independent in Italy. However, there was one state I did want to mention that's pretty important with the whole unification of Italy, and that is the Kingdom of Sardinia, which you can kind of see it's at the top left, and it's also the island of Sardinia as well. That was the only actual major independent state that was really in Italy. It kind of went back to the Middle Ages, late Middle Ages, 1324. It's around till 1861, and has a dynasty that's called the House of Savoy. It's got territory called Savoy that's right above Piedmont in northern Italy. Savoy, I think now is a separate area that's under the French now, but they controlled that area and that purple area in the northern part of Italy, and they also controlled the island of Sardinia, which is right below Corsica. They had a capital. The capital you can see that where it says Piedmont was a capital called Turin, also called Torino as well. And eventually, by the 1850s, it became a constitutional monarchy. It was ruled by this king named Victor Emmanuel II, who's considered one of the fathers of the fatherland that helped to unify Italy. And it was run with a bicameral parliament. And eventually, in 18, I think, I want to say 50s, Count Cavour, you see in that image right there on the left, he would become the first prime minister of Piedmont, Sardinia. And then later, he would also become the first prime minister of Italy, the Kingdom of Italy, which will form later. And he's considered to be really one of the most important figure, really, that really helps to unify Italy. I think they say that Mazzini was the heart of the Italian unification movement. Cavour was the brains behind it. And I'll get to later, Garibaldi, you've heard of him, famous Italian general, was the sword of the whole unification movement, of course, in Italy. Now, one of the things that happened to unify Italy, one of the things that Cavour did, Cavour made this deal with Emperor Napoleon III that was later called the Plomblades Agreement, which I think was a verbal agreement that was made between Napoleon III and the Second French Empire and the Kingdom of Sardinia in July of 1858. And what the agreement was that Napoleon III would help to drive out Austria, their forces out of like northern Italy, in exchange for territories that the Kingdom of Sardinia had, which was Nice, where the city of Nice is now part of France, and also Savoy. So both those areas were given to the French, I think by 1860, later on, which I think Garibaldi wasn't too happy about because that's where he was born, in Nice. And that became part of a treaty called the Treaty of Turin, signed in 1860 between France and later the Kingdom of Italy. And so that sparked a war in Italy that later was called, it had all kinds of names. The Italians usually call it the Second Italian War of Independence. I think some people call it the Italian War of 1859. I think it's got all kinds of names. I think they dub it. Austro Franco War, something like that. It's got all kinds of names, but basically, with the combination of the French Sardinian forces, which were led by Garibaldi, they were able to drive the Austrians out of northern Italy. And so that war ended within just a few months. It was a very short war. It only lasted like a few months. And what ended up happening was the Sardinians then took control of most of northern Italy, I think minus Venetia, which they'll later get in 1866. But that was part of the so-called Treaty of Villafranca. And so that they start combining that territory, kind of where that red line is in the middle of northern Italy in that map. So that area, they start to push the Kingdom of Sardinia down more towards Rome. And at one point, they even moved the capital to Florence from Turin at that point. Now, of course, I was talking about Garibaldi. He, of course, very, very famous figure also in the unification movement. Garibaldi was this Italian general and revolutionary, and he had nicknames. And some people called him the Red One because he would wear these reddish shirts in battle, and his men would wear red shirts as well. And so they were later, his forces were sometimes called the Red Shirts in Italy. He also had other names like the Hero of the Two Worlds because he fought in Europe, but also in a bunch of revolutions in like South America. He was a very wanted general everywhere because he was considered a military genius. I think it was even a case during the American Civil War where Abraham Lincoln tried to get him to come over to America to fight the Confederates. Like he was going to give him command of the Union armies, but he turned him down and all that. And what Garibaldi's famous for, his forces, the Red Shirts, actually they had a nickname. They were called the Expedition of the 1,000 or 1,000, which I think had like 1,100, 1,200 men in his force. And they invaded the southern part of Italy, which I told you was controlled by the Kingdom of the Two Sicilies. And with his forces, they were able to eventually take Sicily first from the south and then push up into Naples towards Rome. And then later, all that territory will eventually be annexed, of course, into the Kingdom of Sardinia. And really that state down there, the Kingdom of Sardinia was really that Kingdom of the Two Sicilies, it was really weak state. They were able to march in there and easily just take it over at that point. Eventually, what happened was Garibaldi eventually met with King Victor Emmanuel II. I think Garibaldi had favored a Republican state. That was the only thing I think that Garibaldi was kind of fighting for, which I think he kind of supported Mazzini's idea of that. But eventually they kind of agreed on a unified state that becomes a Kingdom of Italy, is what occurs. So Kingdom of Italy is born 1861. It'll be, of course, last until 1946. Victor Emmanuel II will be one of two rulers of it. He's got a son later named Victor Emmanuel III, who reigns later. And Cavour, who we talked about, would become the first prime minister of the Kingdom of Italy, but he would only live a few months after he would take power. If you go back to that map I showed you a second ago, I think I've got right here on the right there. They eventually do take Rome. Rome is also added into also Italy as well, which they will do in 1871. And the Pope and the Catholic Church, which had controlled the Papal States area, which went back to like the Middle Ages, going back to the Franks, they lost that area. And so the Pope only has the Vatican City left, like to rule over in Italy. And Rome, of course, will be the capital of pretty much Italy from 1871, of course, to the present. But like I said, the Italians will have a monarchy until 1946 after World War II, and then now of course today it is a republic overall. Now I'm going to get into next. I'm going to discuss also a little bit into also get into talking about German unification as well, because that's the other major issue that comes next in Europe. And they think that was the most important thing that really changed Europe drastically, changes the whole balance of power in Europe, is because Germany unifies, of course, in the late 19th century. So German unification began really under Prussia. Prussia was the major power that really caused the unification pretty much of the German state later. This occurs under Wilhelm I, who's later called Kaiser, as you know. And I'll get to it later, but we'll talk mainly about Otto von Bismarck. Bismarck's really the major figure that really is the brains behind really the unification of Germany right here. There, of course, Bismarck right there. Bismarck, of course, a little bit about him. He was a German politician that was really the brains, like I said, behind the German unification. He came from the Junker aristocratic class in Prussia. And eventually he held the position of prime minister of Prussia originally, which I think they called it, back in those days, minister president. He was also the main foreign minister of Prussia for a bunch of years overall. Bismarck is very famous for his nickname. He's often, known as the so-called Iron Chancellor. You might have heard that term being used for all about him. And he was called that because of a speech he gave one time that was called the famous Blood and Iron speech, when I think he became prime minister of Prussia at the time. And Bismarck stressed the need for military preparedness to solve what they call the German question. The German question was this idea of what was the best way to achieve, unification of the German people, like throughout Europe. And he felt like the best way to really do that was to drive the Austrians out of the German Confederation, which controlled that part of Central Europe at the time, and then unify all the other German states in what he called the Greater Germany, of course. So they're going to try to drive the Austrians out, basically. And he had a famous speech he gave, like I told you, called the Blood and Iron speech. He said famously that the great questions of our day cannot be solved by speeches and majority votes. That was the great mistake of 1848 and 49, but by blood and iron. He's talking about the revolutions of 1848 and all that. And so Bismarck is going to be the one that's going to eventually unify the state. He's really the brains behind it. And I'll kind of talk about some major events that really lead to German unification in the late 19th century. So that's Wilhelm I, who was the Hohenzollern ruler of Prussia at the time. You can see that most of Prussia was in the northern part of Germany today, and also part of East Prussia. That's now part of Poland now. You see, those are all the major areas that they controlled. And then the southern areas are going to eventually unite with it as well to create this German empire that'll, of course, form later. Now, I'll kind of talk about some major events that really led to it. They believe that one of the first things that really helped to unify Germany together was a famous war, which has all kinds of nicknames. Austro-Prussian War, I think it's one common name. They often called it. And it also, they have also other names. They call it the German War in Germany, of course, was another name they called it. And then some people call it the 7 Weeks War because it only lasted 7 weeks in about June, July of 1866. And there was a cause of this war. Apparently, there was a conflict between Prussia and Austria over what they call Schleswig-Holstein, which is an area, by the way, that's kind of part of like Germany, I think part of Denmark now in the northern part of Germany. And it was often referred to as the Schleswig-Holstein question about where that territory should be part of Germany or should it be part of Denmark. And so they think that helped to cause conflict between the two states. And then war broke out of course, in the summer of 1866. And so it was really a war that Austria, regretted, and forces under the general Helmut von Moltke, which were more advanced than really the Austrian side, they basically just routed the Austrians in a quick conflict that only lasted just, like I said, a few weeks between June, July of 1866, and Prussia was backed by also the Kingdom of Italy in that conflict, and so Moltke is like one of several famous Prussian generals that were well known, of course, in the 19th century. Also think of like Gebhard, Blücher, which I think we've talked about, who battled Waterloo and all that. I think Moltke had a nephew later that was also Helmut von Moltke the Younger. He was not as good as him, but he was also a general also in World War One. I'll kind of talk about this particular conflict, by the way. They think that part of why the Prussian side was more successful was the fact that it was one of the first major wars where they started using bolt-action rifles, which you can see there, the so-called Dries needle gun was first used in that conflict, which breech loading rifle is a type of rifle where you can load the actual bullet, into the chamber you see instead of through the muzzle at the top, basically. And so that proved to be pivotal, really, in the war. And that picture I was showing you earlier, that was from the Battle of Königgrätz, which was fought, they think, in Bohemia in July of 1866. That was considered really the most pivotal battle, really, of the 7 Weeks' War. And they do think that the bolt-action rifle did play kind of a major role in it, because the Prussian side had 220,000 troops, and the Austrian side had 250,000 troops. They actually outnumbered the Prussian side, but the bolt-action rifle proved to be obviously, because they could shoot faster, with a bolt-action rifle more than a muzzle-loading type rifle, and so Austria suffered like 44,000 casualties, which most of that was like troops that were captured, by the way. The Prussians only had like 9,000 casualties, to kind of give you an idea about that battle. So that battle was kind of important, Königgrätz, in really leading to eventually, Germany unifying. And so one of the things that happens after that war ends is that Germany then unifies in the north. You get this new state that kind of forms, which is called the Northern, it's got different names, Northern German Confederation, or also the other name they call it is the North German Confederation, which really helps to alter the balance of power in Europe, because you got this now new unified Germany that's starting to come about at this point. And it is around from about 1867 to about 1871, roughly. And this actual new German state is going to be the prototype to the Federal Republic of Germany, which will form later, of course, in the 20th century. And so you'll start to see Germany starting to unify at that point. This confederation, by the way, had a population, you can see, of like something like 30 million people living under it, which 80% of the people, of course, that lived under it were in Prussia, of course. 3/4 of that area will be, of course, part of the so-called German Empire that they'll have later. I think some of my ancestors that lived in Prussia were living in the western part of it, which would be kind of far left part of the map, called the Rhineland. It's like around the Rhine rivers where a bunch of my relatives came from, on my father's side anyway. So anyway, so now I'll also talk about this other thing that happened too, that occurs, of course, because of the fact that, oh, and by the way, I want to back up here. I forgot to talk about one more thing I did want to mention about this state we're talking about, which is the North German Confederation. It is a constitutional monarchy. That's something that you do see pretty much that's created, because Germany's going more towards a constitutional monarchy. King Wilhelm, of course, becomes its ruler of it, of course, as the monarch that reigns over the state. Then Bismarck will become the chancellor of it. which we'll use that term later for also Germany, when he's the Chancellor of Germany as well. They do have an elected parliament, which is called the Reichstag, which is direct representation, of course. They do have the Bundestag as well, which was more of a council type assembly, which was more people appointed to it, which is later. But the Reichstag was the main parliament where you could get elected to it throughout the state. And it's later under also the Weimar Republic in the early 20th century as well. Now, yeah, I did want to talk about also what happened to, because of Austria losing that war, they do have this thing called the Austro-Hungarian compromise that occurs in 1867, which occurs between Austria and Hungary, which really the only two states that really had any power in the Austro-Hungarian Empire. It was caused by discontent with Hungary. Hungary had, by the way, revolted back in 1848. They had this thing called the Hungarian Revolution of 1848. And I think the Austrians had practically ruled over it like a dictatorship afterwards, but they wanted more rights afterwards. And so they get this compromise between the two states that form. And you can see all the territories of what becomes Austria-Hungary, of course, later by going into the early 20th century. And the House of Habsburg basically would recognize there's these two main states. You got the Austrian Empire, and then you got the Kingdom of Hungary, and they basically rule with one single monarch that would reign over both of them. I think they sometimes called it an emperor king, is what it was referred to later overall. So the Habsburg ruler would be Habsburg reign, Emperor of Austria, and then also the King of Hungary as well. The weird thing about these two states is that they had separate parliaments. It's weird. So Hungary had a parliament, Austria had a parliament. They even had separate prime ministers. There would be a prime minister of Hungary, prime minister of Austria as well. But they shared a common military. So the Austro-Hungarian military would all fight together, like in their armies or their navy as well. And the main ruler of this state, which we've talked about before, will later be Emperor Franz Joseph I, who was one of the longest reigning rulers of the Habsburgs, especially Habsburg reign dynasty anyway. And he'll reign from 1867 to 1916. He's the monarch when World War I, of course, will break out. But it's kind of like a constitutional monarchy also as well. But people in Europe will later call it Austria-Hungary or the Austro-Hungarian Empire. And it's one of the major states that, lead into, of course, World War I. They don't cause it, especially with the assassination of the Archduke Franz Ferdinand. Now, the other big conflict that really caused the unification of Germany is the Franco-Prussian War. This conflict was a major conflict in Europe in the late 19th century that occurred between the North German Confederation, of course, and the Second French Empire of Napoleon III. And so these two would go to war. Not too many other powers backed either side, of course, in this war. I'll kind of explain like some causes of why the war broke out. But we'll see this war is kind of important. It's a decisive war that really leads to the Germans winning and also helping to unify the German state into an empire, which will emerge, of course, in 1871. And it's kind of weird about this war. This war was actually a conflict that they think was caused by actually neither side. It was caused by apparently an incident that happened in Spain. In Spain, they had a revolution break out, which I think was sometimes called the Glorious Revolution of 1868, where revolutionaries overthrew Queen Isabel II, who was a Bourbon ruler. They put in a democracy of some type, which was a provisional government in the state. But they eventually get overthrown, and they decide to put a monarchy back in. And Prussia favored putting in this monarch that was named Prince Leopold. He was a cousin of King Wilhelm I. He was actually a Hohenzollern, a cousin of his. But Napoleon III of France Second French Empire, he didn't want a Hohenzollern ruler in there. He wanted someone else that was non-Hohenzollern. And so there was the one he wanted to put in power was Amadeo I, who was Italian. He was like related back to the House of Savoy, Kingdom of Sardinia that becomes Italy. And so that's the two sides that basically, the different ones that are there. Apparently there was an incident where there was a telegram sent by Bismarck about him and King Wilhelm with the French. And there was a deal where the French had asked Wilhelm if he would, apparently what happened was Amadeo was the one that eventually gets the throne. And what happens is Leopold decides to revoke his candidacy for the actual throne of Spain. And Wilhelm said that he would still back Prince Leopold if he decided to, do a second time, maybe if he wanted to renew his candidacy or whatever. And so Bismarck took whatever Wilhelm said, like remarks wise, and he kind of changed what he said a little bit, shortened it a little bit. And so the M's telegrams, they called it, kind of implied that Wilhelm was insulting the French by his kind of showing still some support of Prince Leopold. And so that's actually what provokes the war between basically France and of course, the North German Confederation, mostly led by Prussia at that point. So both sides eventually mobilize in the summer of 1870 because of this. And it's going to be no contest, this particular conflict. And of course, what ends up happening is the German forces invade through northeastern France, come through the eastern border, close where the Rhineland is, you can see in that map. And they invade with an army that close to like 200,000 troops, which was probably more than the French had. I think the French only had like 130,000 troops that they amassed to fight. And the pivotal battle of the Franco-Prussian War was a battle called the Battle of Sedan, which lasted basically 3 days, September 1st to September 3rd, 1870. And what ended up happening was the German forces actually encircled the main French armies that were around Sedan near the Belgian border at that point. And one of the most famous things that happened with that, if you know about it, was that the German forces actually captured most of the actual French army that was there. They actually encircled it, and a little over 100,000 French troops actually surrendered as prisoners of war. And it included also the capture of Emperor Napoleon III, who you see in that image there with Bismarck kind of sitting next to him on the right. That's a very famous image, basically. And so, yeah, the end of Emperor Napoleon III is kind of a farce. His whole empire collapses right afterwards because of that. And what's going to happen is eventually the French are going to declare another republic at that point, which I think it's the Second French Republic that kind of comes in. Actually, the third French Republic will be founded at that point afterwards. Although there is a case where the some of the French were kind of radical. I think they're called the Paris Commune, kind of seized control of the country, which were led by communists and socialists and things like that. But it only lasted about 2 months on Paris. But what happened was from there, the Germans then laid siege to Paris, which lasted about 4 months from September in the fall to about January of 1871. And eventually Paris was forced to capitulate and basically end the war. From there, what happened then, the German Empire then formed. January 18th, 1871, Wilhelm becomes Kaiser. He's now German emperor, basically, of Germany. And so the so-called German Empire, or I think that what the Germans call it is the Dutch Reich, is what they say it, the German Reich or German Empire, which forms, and it'll last from 1871 to 1918 in World War I. And there'll be three rulers that will be German emperors that'll reign till World War One. Of course, Wilhelm II, I'll get to later, is the most famous one. That'll be later. Bismarck, of course, the brains behind the whole unification of Germany. He would become the first chancellor of Germany afterwards. And they did have a treaty that was signed between both sides, between the French and the Germans. It was known as the Treaty of Frankfurt. That officially ended the Franco-Prussian War. And Germany ended up getting Alsace-Lorraine, which is kind of close to the Rhineland. It's in the northeastern part of France. They get that territory. And the French will have to pay the Germans something like 5 million indemnity, which are kind of like reparations. And that kind of sows the seeds between the hatred between the French and the Germans, which will kind of continue, into World War One, World War Two, and all that. They think the Franco-Prussian War is definitely a war that they think later influenced like World War One. Now I'm going to, of course, move on to talk about, we'll kind of get into other issues in 19th century, like imperialism, but you can see the map of Europe after that. This Europe in 1871. You can see this new state, the German Empire, which is kind of formed between Russia and now France. And so that's going to help to cause an imbalance of power in Europe. Germany is now going to be a rival state to other powers like France, the British Empire, the Russian Empire. And so that's going to help to later cause, World War One to break out, which we'll talk about that, of course, next week. Now I'm going to get into next. I've got some time left. I want to talk about also what they call new imperialism, which was something that was big that started in the 19th century, and it kind of goes up to World War One. In the late 19th century, you got up to World War One. You got this period where they have an age of imperialism, where all these powers in Europe start to try to create colonies throughout parts of the world. Africa being the most famous, of course, parts of Asia, the Pacific, close to the Indian Ocean, and all that. And so they often refer to it as being called new imperialism because of the fact that the Europeans were trying to exploit all these areas of the world because of economic reasons, which they think had an extension as part of the age of capitalism, which was beginning in the 19th century, which had to do with also the Industrial Revolution, which we talked about that had already started. And so they wanted cheap natural resources, cheap labor, cheap new markets, to exploit and sell goods to. And also areas to colonize, because parts of Europe were becoming, overpopulated. And so they wanted to move to certain areas, be able to own land and things like that overall. You can see this map here. You can see those are the different areas of the world that were, at one point taken over by the Europeans. Africa, most famous, of course, they had the so-called scramble for Africa, as they called it, where, they start carving up different parts of the world. And even in Asia, of course, you've got the British, especially in Asia, of course, taking over all these areas overall. Of course, there's a difference between old imperialism and new. Old imperialism went back to 16th century, going back to the conquistadors and up to like the 18th century, where conquest of the Americas was the big thing that was starting to kind of take off the most overall. But then you can see new imperialism is more focused on, pushing into parts of Africa and Asia. Those some of the major powers, Germany, Italy, Belgium, they're the ones that kind of were in it, especially the British. The British and the French were the ones that were probably the most famous. United States, Japan also got into it as well. Spain and Portugal were kind of involved too, but they were already kind of involved on certain parts of the world at that time overall. Even the United States got into it, like manifest destiny. That's something that we hear about, of course, in the United States, which was a movement to push, all the way to the Pacific Ocean, the East Coast to the West Coast in the United States. And you can see here that, eventually all that was territory that was taken from other powers. Louisiana purchased from France. Republic of Texas was gotten mostly from the Spanish. You can see the southwestern areas of the United States, California, Nevada, Arizona, Utah, parts of New Mexico were gotten from the Mexicans. Northwestern part, of course, gotten from the British also as well, like Oregon, Idaho, Washington. Alaska from Russia, Hawaii from the Polynesians. So we took all that territory from other people, over time. And also the Philippines, we go into the Caribbean, and things like that also as well. But I want to talk about the British. Really, when you think of the British, they were the ones that really were the model for people to want to imperialize and colonize different parts of the world. We had talked about how the British Empire at one point controlled something like 1/4 of the world's landmass, especially by the 1920s overall. And their empire at one point would control Canada, part of the Caribbean, British Guiana and South America, Belize and Central America, Egypt, Sudan, Nigeria, South Africa, Rhodesia, I guess, India, Australia, New Zealand, and even parts of like China at one point. So their empire was vast, in size. And I think the size of their empire at one point was like 11 to 12 million square miles, which was a huge, huge amount of territory. Imperialism was also part of, don't forget, national pride. And so you had this case where people had what they call jingoism, where they felt like they had a right to go into these areas and spread their ideas and civilize people and things like that. And you may have heard of this writer named Rudyard Kipling, who he's one that wrote the famous book called The Jungle Book. You may have read or maybe seen movies about the Jungle Book. But he had a poem that was called White Man's Burden, which kind of summed up, British imperialism, that they had to go in there and civilize people and make them like the British people and things like that. And it's kind of a form of racism now, I guess today is seen as overall. But that's kind of what they saw it as back in the 19th century, roughly. So White Man's Burden, that kind of summed it up. Now, one of the things I'll kind of talk about when you think about they think British imperialism was heavily influenced by this man named Dr. David Livingstone, who lived in the 19th century. You may have heard of him. Livingstone was this Christian missionary that went to Africa hoping to convert all of the Africans to Christianity. But he wasn't just involved in that. He also explored parts of Africa, which I think one of the main things that Livingstone was looking for. He was trying to find the source of the Nile River, which he thought was Lake Victoria. And so he would explore parts of East Central Africa. But they do think that Livingstone was a major influence, of course, on why the British would try to colonize what they called the Dark Continent back then. And there was a time at one point where Livingstone, around 1870, disappeared. They were like, oh my God, they can't find him. They thought maybe he had been killed by Africans. And so the New York Post, I believe was the newspaper, sent this reporter named Henry Morton Stanley to try to find him, if you know the story about this. And he found him near Lake Tanganyika, which is, by the way, close to where Tanzania is today. And he said famously to him, Dr. Livingstone, I presume? And so that became basically the influence of Livingstone. They think also Henry Morton Stanley was an influence because he would later go on to become an explorer himself, exploring Africa. I think Stanley was the one that would actually find the source of the Nile. You find like where the rivers go into Lake Victoria and all that. And they believe that Stanley was the one that's going to influence a lot of these other powers to try to colonize eventually afterwards. And it's going to lead to eventually, like Belgium is going to go into like the Congo area, which is in the central part of southern Africa. and they'll colonize that area right there. And under King Leopold II, they'll control that area of the Congo from the 1880s up to the early 1900s, like before World War One. And I don't know if you know about Leopold II. He was kind of infamous for a lot of atrocities happening under him. They exploited mostly the Congo because the Congo had a lot of natural rubber, like rubber trees that were grown there, and so they would harvest the rubber, like the latex liquid from it, to make like natural rubber back in those days. Now they have synthetic rubber now also as well, but it caused supposedly millions of deaths throughout the Congo, which I think the number of deaths vary from 1 million to as high as like 15 million Africans may have been killed or somehow died from anything from disease. And they even had cases where they would cut their hands off. I think they cut their hands off because they wouldn't do the work, whatever, and so they chop their hands off, that kind of thing. And so that was considered to be really considered examples of colonialism, how it kind of was seen as very, awful, and some of the negative aspects of it, of course, that would occur to make, rubber, and all that stuff like that at the time. Now, another thing that happened too, because of what happened with Stanley and others going into Africa, the Germans had this conference that they had in Berlin in 1884, which was backed by Otto von Bismarck. And the idea was to divide up various spheres of influence where the Europeans would have their certain areas that they would control. And so it's after that that really Africa gets divided up into these different areas that you see map-wise. And so French West Africa, you can see it's mostly in that red area right there, which will include countries like Algeria, parts of like Chad and other areas, Morocco, etc. Those are all the areas that will be controlled by them. The British were all over the place. Nigeria, like I said, Egypt, Sudan, parts of like down into Kenya, also later into parts of East Africa, but especially South Africa be an area that they'll, of course, control. Spanish, not much in Africa except the western part, of course, there. But Portuguese had areas like where Mozambique is and Angola. Those are areas that the Portuguese control at one point. Of course, Belgium's in the Congo, like I said. Germany had like parts of East Africa and also Southwest Africa as well. Italy later getting like in Ethiopia as well. But you can see there were very few areas of actual Africa that were independent by the late 19th century. Ethiopia, that's actually one of the last areas that is not actually conquered and taken over by the Europeans, which they called it back in those days Abyssinia, which was an ancient kingdom that went back for hundreds and hundreds of years. And but later it'll be actually conquered by and taken over by the Italians. I think Mussolini later will conquer it. You read about that later, and I think in the 1920s. It'll be later. They do have Liberia. I don't know if you hear about that, but that was another state that was kind of like independent. That really didn't get taken over by the Europeans, but that was a state that America helped to support because there was a movement in the United States back in the 19th century, which was a back to Africa movement where some Africans wanted to go back to Africa and things like that. And so that's what led to its creation and all that, and why it exists now, of course, today. I think Marcus Garvey, you may have heard of him. He was an example, a Jamaican American that was kind of involved in trying to start that movement for Africans to go back to Africa. Yeah, you can see the extent of the British Empire, how vast it was, but they had the most colonies, pretty much overall in Africa. But I'll talk about other conflicts that were also big, that were like at the end of the 19th century that you had. You did have this thing called the Boer War, which broke out in what is South Africa. And this was caused by the fact that you had the British slowly taking over South Africa, but you had other people living there that had been there a long time. The Portuguese, the Dutch, go back to like the 16th century in South Africa. And they're often called Afrikaners, of course, later, but the term they used back then was Boer, B-O-E-R, which was a Dutch word that meant farmer, which most of them were. Anyway, because of the fact that the British kept moving in to South Africa, many of them decided to move northward in what became known as the Great Trek, where these mostly Dutch people pushed northward and eastward into, I guess, the eastern part of South Africa today. And they migrated into areas that are now called Natal, Transvaal, you may have heard of, and the Orange Free State, which are now part of South Africa today. And so they migrated there to get away from the British. But the British eventually moved there too. They moved there as well. And they think a lot of that was caused by the fact that they found gold and also diamonds throughout that area that they could mine. And so that's what actually caused the conflicts. And there were actually two Boer Wars. There was one that was called the First Boer War, where they were actually successful, where the Boers were able to get somewhat independent in that area, 1880s. But after they found gold and diamonds in that area, that led to more influx of the British, and that's what they think would cause eventually the so-called Second Boer War to break out, which is actually what they usually call the main Boer War, which was fought between 1899 to 1902. Considered one of the first, by the way, first major war, I guess, going into the 20th century. The Afrikaners were outnumbered. They only had about 100,000 troops. You can see those are actually Boer forces on the left, right there. And on the right, the British Empire had like 500,000 troops that they had. You can see some British troops on the right with machine guns right there. And one thing about the Boer War, besides being really one of the first major wars that kind of goes into the 20th century, it is one of the first modern wars that really influences like later World War I. Machine guns, trench warfare, use of camouflage and barbed wire and things like that. A lot of that gets used a lot, of course, in this particular conflict. So trench warfare is something you'll start seeing more of going into like future wars later. And in the end, the Dutch side lost. They lost the war, and so Britain became in more control, over basically South Africa. They also go into like where Rhodesia is now, Zimbabwe, and colonize that area also as well. Which a lot of that had to do with like finding like diamonds and gold also in that area as well. Other conflicts that the British were involved in too, which are very famous, is the Opium War. So I'll kind of talk about that a little bit as well. Which the Opium Wars go back to different parts of the 19th century overall. Which there are actually two of these different conflicts. They had the first Opium War, 1839 to 42, and they had the second Opium War, 1856 to 1880. The Chinese at the time was reigned by this dynasty that was called the Qing Dynasty, or also called the Great Qing or Qing, that ruled China going back to the 17th century, 1644 to 1912. They're sometimes also called the Manchu because they originated in Manchuria. And that state became weaker by the time they got up to the 19th century. And the Europeans start to kind of carve out like spheres of influence over it. And one of the things that the British did was they started to corner the market on opium. It was a narcotic. And eventually the Chinese tried to have it banned, but the British military was just too powerful. And eventually in the Opium Wars, the British Navy practically just wiped out the Chinese Navy, their junk ships. And anyway, basically from there, they were forced to agree to a treaty, which became known as the Treaty of Nanking, which was in 1842. And what it did was it created a bunch of these treaty ports in China on their coast, which the British and other powers could trade there. Like the British got Hong Kong pretty much after that. And then they start getting all these other cities they start to carve up as well, which I've got here. I'll show you, which are a bunch of them: Hong Kong, Shanghai, Canton. You may have heard of course, Nanjing as well, Hankow, Changchao, and Chongqing also were other cities that they eventually take control over and trade with. And so within so many years after that, you can see how China gets controlled by all these different foreign powers, not just European, but Japanese also that come in and control different areas of that area. So Russia's in like Mongolia, Japan controls like Korea, Taiwan, Manchuria, and also parts of eastern China as well. Britain controls like most of the eastern southern part of China, like especially around like Hong Kong and all that. The French are also in control too. French are in like southern part of China and also into Indochina as well. So all these areas are dominated by different foreign powers. Then also the British were in India. Don't forget, India was really the cornerstone of the whole British Empire, especially under Queen Victoria, who reigned from 1837 to 1901. And India was very important because they were a big supplier of a lot of their raw materials to make goods, in the Industrial Revolution. And for a long time, India, going back to like the 18th century, was reigned by were controlled by the British East India Company, which originally got the charter, by the way, going all the way back to, you can see, Queen Elizabeth I. That's pretty far back overall. And it was regulated from London, but if you know about it, the East India Company was actually controlled by, they had their own army. The British East India Army that they had some British troops that were in it, like probably the officers, but most of the actual troops that were in it were Indian soldiers, which were called sepoys. And apparently there was an incident that happened in the mid-19th century you may have heard of, that was called they call it different names, the Great Rebellion, I think, of 1857. But a lot of people call it the Sepoy Mutiny or the Sepoy Rebellion of 1857. And what happened was the Indians, mostly in central India, rebelled against the British, which lasted like something like a year and a half that it took for them to put down the mutiny. And because of that, the British were forced to take direct control over India afterwards, which they will start in 1858. And so they put in like a viceroy or governor that controls it under the monarch, Queen Victoria, and it was a viceroy. And so after that, India was known as the Raj, is what they called it afterwards. And so from mid 19th century up to like probably right after World War II, the British will control India for many years, which that's an area that's, by the way, Pakistan, India, Bangladesh, I think is the main areas that were in it. And then also the British controlled, where Burma is, of course, today, or Myanmar. Myanmar is the other name they call it too, as well. But yeah, the British do help to, industrialize the country as well. Don't forget about that, because, they help to, industrialize, build lots of railroads, throughout the country and modernize it. That's one thing about, I think at the time after they did that, the India had like the third largest railroad network, of course, in the world. There's, of course, the sepoys that revolted. Supposedly they revolted because there was a rumor going around that there was the cartridges that went into the rifles. They're using like fat from like either a cow or from pork, and so they revolted. And they think it was really more like nationalist movement early on, because Mahatma Gandhi later is going to, start a whole Indian nationalist movement after World War II to break away. That'll lead to the partition of India, 1947. That's later, 20th century, that happens. One more thing I'll talk about too, that was a big part also of imperialism, is the Boxer Rebellion that broke out in 1900. That might have been one of the last major events, of course, of the 19th century that you have. And what happened was we had talked about how the Qing dynasty, the great Qing dynasty, was declining at that time. And there was a lot of resentment in China with these foreigners that were trying to take over the country. And so they think this ignited the so-called Boxer Rebellion, which actually started in 1899 and will last until like 1901. But people often call it that overall. And you have these nationalist movements that started under the Qing dynasty, where they formed these nationalist movements like the Society of the Righteous, I think was one of them, but they had one that was called the Harmonious Fists, which a lot of the Europeans called them boxers because they used like martial arts. They look like boxing, so they're called boxers basically. And they went around with a slogan, which was "Death to the Foreign Devils." They wanted to basically kick out all the foreigners out of the country. And it broke out in there's kind of some of the soldiers that were kind of involved in it, but it broke out in Peking, Beijing. It's where the rebellion started. And so 8 different nationalities, different countries were involved in trying to put it down. Germany, United States, Japan, other powers in Europe, Russia, British, etc., all sent forces in there to basically crush it. It sounded like 20, 30,000 troops were involved in the actual Boxer Rebellion. And the Boxers killed something like 32,000 Chinese Christians were actually killed, including about maybe 200 Western missionaries. And they think the Boxer Rebellion was pretty bloody. Close to about 100,000 people were actually killed in the Boxer Rebellion. But they do think that the one thing about the Boxer Rebellion, they do think it helped to really cause the decline further of the Qing dynasty, because it's going to eventually collapse in 1912. And what's going to happen is China is going to form a republic, the Republic of China, which was founded by one of the politicians in China you may have heard of, named Sun Yat-sen, considered one of the fathers of the Chinese Republic. So that is one of the last major events, really, that you have, really, of the 19th century that's kind of big, the Boxer Rebellion. But all those events will later help to, like I said, cause, World War I later. The rise of imperialism, rise of nationalism, those are major events. I'll be definitely talking about more, of course, again, next week, because, like I said, next week we'll, of course, focus more, of course, on the 20th century and World War I.